Can you all see okay?
Looks good.
Awesome. So this talk is titled Bulkrax, Getting Data in and Out of Repositories. Notch8 has been doing a lot of work on the Bulkrax engine, which is a method that we put together, having learned a lot about taking and sort of transforming often manually edited data from various sources and trying to bring them into repositories. I'm Rob Kaufman, founding partner at Notch8. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. So what is Bulkrax? It's an engine in Samvera Labs. It's battery included importer and exporter for Samvera applications. It's designed to be extensible. It's hierarchs focused, but is flexible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And it provides a full admin interface for imports and exports. Our goal isn't to necessarily, we're not foolish enough to assume that we can get all of the possible data formats that you're going to want to bring in or out of a repository. But by providing a sort of standardized interface for them, then you can spend your focus, or any development focus can be spent on understanding and parsing the format and not spent trying to do error tracking or retries or sort of the boilerplatey parts that are all the same between all of these import and exports. I will say that the Bulkrax code genesis was from the import in Haiku. And so you'll see that there are a few parts that remain even from that as we go through this. Bulkrax supports full round tripping, so you can, for example, import a CSV, export that CSV, edit it, re-import the CSV. It supports CSV, RDF, Baggett, which then contains either CSVs or RDFs at the moment. An OAI import. Export for OAI is handled already very elegantly by the Blacklight OAI gem, so we don't do OAI export at the moment. Various XML formats, including Fox XML, Mets, and mods, and JSON, which is something that we're actively working on. I think it's going to be really easy. Bulkrax takes a layered approach to extensibility, and this really stems from my experiences doing importers from various flavors throughout my career. I actually did a Rails Conf talk in 2007 about taking user data and trying to clean it up for import. So I've built a lot of importers, and the thing about separations of concerns is the hard part is always about getting the right separations, like getting the layers right. And in my experience so far over the last couple of years with Bulkrax, I feel like we've really started to zero in on what those layers should be. So here's our parfait. We're going to parse the file, and then we're going to prep the data, and then we're going to connect it to the data model. And by doing these things separately, you'll see that we get a lot more options for extensibility, and also it means that there's room for error checking. One of the things that's true about any externally imported source, no matter how clean and pristine people promise you the data is going to be, there are going to be variances. Right? If someone gives you 20,000 records that they swear is perfect, at least 5 of them are going to be missing their title and not going to be able to be imported, right? Like it's just inevitably there are issues with imported data. And so we want to have opportunities to figure out what's going on during the import. If we're importing from external file sources, those external file sources are going to go down sometimes. And when that happens, like we want to be able to recover from that in a graceful way. So the first part, the parsing piece, is handled by a parser class and an entry class. And I wanted this talk to be really deep. There are a lot of overview talks on like how Bulkrax works from a UI perspective as a user. So I wanted to kind of get into the nitty gritty and sort of acknowledge that many of these things will be customized by people trying to use this software. So the parser class reads the incoming data stream, AKA the file, or maybe it's a URL, and is in charge of extracting individual records from that file. So for example, if we get a CSV file, which is essentially an Excel spreadsheet, the parser is going to know how to take each row and split those up into individual parts. The parser might parse a file that only has one record in it. A lot of times you'll get like an XML file or maybe even a Baggett bag RDF file that only has a single record in it at a time. An example is this is the OAI parser, uses the OAI gem to read from the OAI field and converts each individual record into a hash. The CSV parser reads a CSV file using Ruby's CSV library and converts each individual row into a hash, as with the keys being the column headers. The Baget parser is in charge of unzipping the bag and reading either the CSV file or the RDF file, and ultimately sends out each record of metadata as a hash. It also attaches the file paths from the bag. The entry class is in charge of each individual record. It's created with sort of the minimum hash of the raw data. I'm gonna go back a step. So by saving these in active record, that gives us a really good point to background them. It lets us sort of make them more repeatable and more debuggable. And it also gives us this sort of source record of what came in, right? Like the record of authority will obviously be the saved curation concern or work object, but this allows us to sort of have a record of sort of the path of the data coming into the system. And we found these entries to be extremely useful at things like, oh, this record's metadata got messed up. Can you restore it from the import? Yeah, we can just restore that one entry and not have to re-import the whole file. Or there was a temporary issue during last night's upload where all the files that were supposed to be downloaded 404 for 2 hours. Can we, fix just those entries? So it's a really useful point to have. Entry.build will convert the raw metadata into the parsed metadata. So it takes and works through our mapping, which we'll see in a few minutes, to sort of take whatever we're bringing in from this individual file and get it into a format that the object factory can then pass off to actually create the objects. I missed this in my previous slide, but the parser class is just a plain old Ruby object. So it is a class that's in charge of, or an instance that's in charge of handling that parser file and isn't saved anymore. Next, we're going to talk about matchers. I'm also going way too fast, so I'm going to try and slow down a little bit. This is the matcher configuration for a fairly complex CSV import. And this would be in our config initializers Bulkrax file. So the parser hash or the field mapping hash here, we might see that, so access control ID, this might be present in the CSV, but we're going to exclude it. We're going to ignore it. In the CSV, the header is additional information, and we want to map that in our metadata schema to add info. So that's what this from and to piece here is. Another interesting one is this alternate identifier. Alternate identifier is a compound object in the stored system. And so we map alternate identifier as identifier as alternate identifier inside of an object called alternate identifier. So it's kind of alternate identifier, which is not ideal, but that's the metadata schema that we have for this one particular application. And then each alternate identifier also has a type. And so the field in the CSV is alternate identifier type that gets mapped into alternate identifier type, which again, is silly, but that's how it works in the system, in the metadata schema that we have to start with. The book title is normal. Another really important one is the source identifier. I highly recommend when you're importing and exporting data, if at all possible, to use an external identifier, not the system's generated identifier. The reason for this is if I re-import the same data, so let's say I have records showing up in the CSV, I import them, maybe I export them later, maybe I re-import the original CSV because I messed something up. Like, it allows the records to be easily identified and updated as opposed to creating new records. It's not always possible, and Bulkrax will supply a source identifier for you. It'll fill that field in during an initial import if necessary. So I think that kind of gives us some flexibility, but if we can have an external identifier, it makes round tripping a whole lot easier. And it means that you're not going to your metadata uploaders and saying, hey, you have to be super careful not to put records in twice or you'll get duplicates. And then there's another example here of this sort of compound object. So contributor is a child object of the work in the system, and it ends up getting a family name, a given name, a grid, an ISNI, name type, and an ORCID. And those things all come in. Bulkrax knows how to parse those so that what it brings to the system is contributor attributes with those values. Any given field has a from, which we just looked at, and the to, which is the sort of the key in that hash. And the from is the field in the source data. So it's the column title in the CSV. It's the XML tag name in an XML parser. And then it has a single destination in the model. So we can have multiple froms leading into a single to. And I think I had an example of that. Did I trim it out here accidentally? Yeah, I trimmed it out. This particular one that I was drawing from, there are several places where British English wants an S and American English wants a Z, and we support both in this import. So the field names might be different. They might be wildly different. So you can have multiple froms that all go to a single destination. The fields can be gathered up in an object, and I just showed this sort of example of a user. They would come in as user with family name, given name, and ORCID. And we talked about the source identifier, the sort of being an outside the system piece and an inside the system piece. So the source identifier is both a single concept, and it kind of also has two sides to it, right? Like there's the source identifier name and the work identifier name, depending on whether we're talking about what might be in the external data versus what's in our internal data model. During this processing piece where we're taking the raw metadata and converting it to the parse metadata, we might call a parse field method. So if there's a parse resource, so if resource type is found, it'll know, it can be denoted in our configuration that that's a parsed field, in which case it'll look for a parse resource type method. This one specifically looks up a resource label and says, hey, if it's not one that's in our control vocabulary, then blank it in the import. So don't write non-valid resource type labels to the system. You can do, I have them for URLs that like clean up all the different kinds of URLs. We had a large import where all of the remote files were HTTP, but the upstream had changed to be HTTPS only. So we like fixed that during import with a parse method. The field might be split. So we might have a single title field where we have up to 4 or 5 titles that are just delineated by a pipe character, or sometimes it's a semicolon. There are a lot of different options of what that character that splits things could be. And so you can customize that. And then often there are times where you expect semicolons, for example, in a description. You wouldn't want to split on the semicolon there, because then you would just have multiple descriptions split, kind of willy-nilly based on, actual legitimate English use of the semicolon. It may be implied. So for example, a CSV import, if the name of the column header matches a name in your of a property in your system, you don't have to specify. So if it's just title goes to title, you don't have to specify that in this grid. So if they're like really straightforward, they don't have to be specified. You can skip those. I did have an example. So alt title can come from alternative title, alt title, or extra title. Now we've got our parse metadata. It's saved in our database. And we're going to send that off to the object factory. The object factory is the piece that actually connects to the sort of overarching application. So the Bulkrax ships with an object factory that connects to Hyrax. And the goal of it is to take the parse metadata and make it as much like a form post as possible. So for example, you might have collection ID as the field that you import, and that's what comes through your parse metadata, but you really want to set members of collection attributes as a hash that contains an ID in order to, when you save that record, get the collection attached. So you're sort of making it as much like if you went to the web form and hit submit as possible. And the reason for that step is that allows us to not be in charge of actually writing your object to the database. Like this application or Bulkrax shouldn't care whether what actors you have in your line. It shouldn't matter sort of what pre-processing steps, what are your before save triggers, what are your after save triggers, like all of that should be handled by your application, and Bulkrax should just do what your form does. And this means the data leaving the object, we want it to follow that same path as much as possible. And that's the job of the object factory. Bulkrax's default object factory assumes a hierarchs-like process. It creates an environment object and passes in an address hash to it. It knows whether to trigger a create or an update, because those are two different paths in hierarchs. It makes sure that files, associations, etc., are as much like the web form as possible. In the hierarchs example, it then hands everything over to the actor stack, which is the same thing the controller does when you submit a new work. And then kind of lets it go free from there to process. Making a different kind of object factory would be a pretty straightforward process. So having one that saves to active record or to Valkyrie, that's just this one object factory class that would need to be modified to support that. So that is part of what I said about it being kind of hierarchs dependent but flexible. There's a couple of controllers and views that assume sort of hierarchs basic styling that might be modified if you weren't using Bootstrap, for example. But otherwise, things are, the object factory is really the thing that would have to be changed. All of the parsing logic, all of the entry stuff, that's all transferable to other systems. So what kinds of things could we override? We can customize the field mapping. So we saw that that's a configuration file at the moment. And I'll talk a little bit more about the field mapping and why it's written the way it is in my next slide. But it gives us a really good place to just, if we're just using a CSV parser or an existing XML parser, then we might want to change our mapping a little bit to match our metadata schema, and that can be done without any with just that one hash being changed. We can, there's this, every entry calls add local as a method towards the end of the entry process. And so that allows you to override this one concern and get control over your entries. So for example, if what is normally remote files in your system is somehow called special remote files, you could change the hash there at the very end as the last step. Or if you have a complex compound field that needs to draw from other places, you could take the raw metadata hash and process it to get all the different parts, look up whatever you need to look up in the system, and then save that to the parsed metadata hash. If that's not enough, then you can and you can add your own parsed fields. So for example, if when in my URL processing example where we had to put the S on all the HTTP links, that's not something that's generally applicable. It was useful in this one moment in time. It's not the default case. So we added our own matcher for that. And then there's the custom parser. So we can inherit from one of Bulkrax's parsers. There's an application parser, which is the base class. And then obviously CSV, XML, et cetera. Child classes, you can inherit and create your own parser. And then you can add these to the UI through a configuration in the Bulkrax initializer. So there's a spot when you default install this that'll show you the pattern for adding your own parser. The custom entries, overriding the entry class on the parser. This one method would get you whatever entry class you want to use. These are active record objects. They're inheritable. You can add concerns to them. They're extensible in kind of all the Rails-y Ruby ways. And then you can override the object factory by changing the entry class's object factory class method. You could say, Valkyrie factory or active record factory or whatever, class you wanted to add to your application. So you can see here, there's lots of points to sort of pull things into your app and make adjustments. let's talk about where Bulkrax is going next. So some of the future enhancements we're working on right this minute is better control over updates with remote files. So a very recent addition to Bulkrax is if you update an imported record and you add and you put new files on it that have the exact same file signature, you're going to get an updated version of that file. Previously, it would, you either had to leave existing files alone and skip them, or remove all the existing files and then add the files again. And now you have the option that it will do a proper version update of that file during the update process. We're working on applying the same thing to remote files. Remote files are a little trickier. You have to download them every time, so that means it's kind of slow, but ultimately we can still say, hey, this is the file name, this is the file name in the file set, original file name from the file set. Do they match? Are they different? Okay, upload it again. We're working on improved relationship support. So basically saying this work belongs to that work. That's in super active development right now. There's some preliminary support for it right now, but it's not very robust and it only goes one direction. I believe it assumes that all parents know about their children, and now we're looking to support the children knowing about the parent. I could have that 100% reversed, but the idea is that in your initial data, the relationship knowledge might go either way, and so we want to support both. And then also adding metadata to collections and file sets at time of upload. So in your import, being able to say, okay, here's the metadata for this work. It'll have these files attached to it, and this file set will have this additional metadata. We're continuing to add additional parsers for new data types. As adoption has grown, we've definitely seen sort of an explosion of parsers that are very specific for given institutions, but many of them also have more generally applicable concepts. So we're trying to get some of those contributed back to Bulkrax so that it kind of comes with more examples and more options. And I'd like to get the gem promoted out of labs. It has the CI stuff taken care of. It has the test coverage, I think, is where it needs to be at this point. It's being used by way more than 3 institutions in the wild. So I'd like to sort of start that conversation and get that done. I'd hope to do it before Connect, but I'm probably not the only one who got a little busy in the run up to the conference. So we'll try and get that done, in the next month or so. And then another thing that's in progress is the ability to rerun a specific entry from the UI. So I might go in and say, well, 200 of my things succeeded. These 2 failed. I just want to run them again and see if they run this time. Or the dev said they pushed an update last week. I'm going to run these 2 and see if they're working. I don't want to run the whole set because it takes a bunch of time. So I'll just rerun these 2. And if they go green, then I'll rerun the whole set. So it's a nice, UI ability to rerun a specific entry. And then the last kind of big thing in the horizon for Bulkrax is the field mapping UI. One of the reasons the field mapping is kept as a hash the way it is that we did some thought work around and some design work around possibly creating a user interface for the field mapping. The way that would work is you would go in and create your importer just like you do today. And then when you hit submit, it would read your file. I'm going to go specific on a CSV example just because it's easy to conceptualize. And it would look at the headers and maybe give you the first 5 rows of that file. And then you would be able to say in a React or Vue-based interface, okay, title goes to title, alternative title goes to alt title. This one needs to go to a parser. This one needs to go to be split with this control character. You could basically do all of that on an import basis. A big advantage of that, obviously, is it makes the whole thing way more self-serve, and it means that you can individualize and say this CSV file has these mappings, and this other CSV has these other mappings. In order to do that successfully, there's quite a bit of UI work to do and some significant JavaScript to make it user-friendly. But that's something I'd really like to see get into Bulkrax, and all of the infrastructure is there to support that. As long as what it produces at the end of the day is a JSON or Ruby hash representation of that the initializer's mapping, it can be saved in the record and processed forward from there. All right. that's my presentation. I would be more than happy to take questions. Looks like I have a few minutes remaining.
We've got a few questions, Rob. I'll just read them out. What does the arc_ID stand for regarding the source identifier?
So this is a thing about this particular source data. The records coming in all have an ARC ID from an existing external system. And so we're mapping that in to a metadata field called ARC ID, but they're guaranteed unique across all of the records for this particular implementation. And so we're using that as sort of this external source. It's set as the source identifier because that is like Bulkrax will fall back on using the internally generated ID if it doesn't have another source of uniqueness. But again, for the like, oh, I accidentally uploaded a record I previously uploaded case, it's really nice to have an external unique identifier.
Another question we had was, how can an enterprising team who are prospective Bulkrax users become involved in development and planning for the gem?
So Bulkrax is in the Samvera Labs repository. I can't tell you how proud I was to start seeing external folks, maybe people I didn't even know, adding PRs and opening issues. That makes me feel really good about this thing that we put together and put a lot of work into. So it's definitely expanded outside of the Nachi team itself. As far as like roadmap planning goes, there hasn't been a lot of that yet, but I'm really open to conversations. Just reach out to me in Slack or via email, and I'd be more than happy to chat about that. If we get a big enough sort of audience for it, we'll probably start an interest group for it.
Thanks. We also have, how does it work with cloud files like AWS S3 files?
So Bulkrax supports remote files, and right now it supports them by downloading them, right? So if you had S3 URLs in your work, then it would be able to pull those in. The other way to attach cloud files is it does support browse everything. So when, for example, you do a CSV upload, you can put in the CSV file, and then there's 3 selectors. You can choose a local path on the server to where the files might be located. You can put a upload of a zip file that contains all the files, or you can open the Browse Everything window and select those files from an S3 bucket or Dropbox or Google Drive or all of the places that Browse Everything supports. And it's able to then, it pulls those down locally and attaches them properly to the works as it processes those records.
All right, those were all the questions that I saw, and we're just about time for our next presentation.